Shortly after Northwestern University was chartered in 1851, the school's founders sought to create a center of learning near the rapidly growing city of Chicago. They decided to purchase a rural area perched on small bluffs along Lake Michigan, about 12 miles north of the city. Over the next 160 years, more than 100 buildings were constructed to meet the needs of Northwestern's increasing size and expanding educational mission. But the university's growth has been incremental, a fact that is reflected in the variety of architectural styles found throughout the campus. From the Gothic elegance of University Hall and the downtown Chicago campus, to the state-of-the-art design of the recently opened Silverman Hall, Northwestern's buildings survey the history of the university and the evolution of American architecture. The story of Northwestern and its architecture begins with Old College. The university's first building was a wood frame structure that opened in November of 1855, when 2 professors and 5 students gathered for the university's first classes. Northwestern's earliest buildings were constructed on the southern end of campus, and many remain to this day.
One of the great things about this campus in general, in this particular area, is that it's a real catalog, a museum, if you will, of architectural styles.
Well, it definitely is an interesting collection of buildings that we have on campus. In some ways, they reflect the different generations that have gone here. There's no one distinctive style that has united the various generations. So there are a lot of buildings that are of their age.
Throughout Northwestern's history, the physical shape of the university's land would be a challenge in the development of a cohesive campus plan.
One of the challenges of planning the university, actually very early on in its history, was that it's a very long and narrow site. And while beautiful and while the bluffs were lovely, to plan and to build a campus along such a narrow site has been very difficult. It was meant to be a rural campus at that time, which suggested that the buildings be sited rather casually on a meadow. As Evanston grew, as space became more precious, that was no longer possible.
The oldest building on campus is also one of the most recognizable, University Hall. Completed in 1869 and now home to the English department, the structure was designed in a high Victorian Gothic style and uses the same Joliet limestone as Chicago's historic water tower.
University Hall is obviously meant to have an ecclesiastical feel, which is reflected in the Gothic massing and the towers which resemble steeples.
The clock in the building's highest tower was a gift from the class of 1879. The bells were added by the class of 1880.
When University Hall opened in 1869, it was one of 2 buildings possessed by Northwestern University. Done in stone, it was reflective of the university's newfound strength and finances. It announced to the world that the university was on solid footing. But because the university was very small, and because its ambitions at that time were relatively modest, the buildings served many purposes. Inside University Hall, you would have found a museum, a laboratory, classrooms, offices for faculty, and up at the top, rooms for a few students. Another key building on the south end of campus is what is now known as the Music Administration Building, originally the home to the Evanston College for Ladies. The building opened in 1874 and was the work of Gurdon P. Randall, a prominent Chicago architect. Randall also designed University Hall.
MAB represents the beginning of coeducation at Northwestern. It was first known as Willard Hall in honor of Frances Willard, the university's first Dean of Women. Moving farther north on campus, Northwestern made a scientific splash in 1888 with the opening of the Dearborn Observatory. When it opened, Dearborn was home to the world's largest telescope.
Another interesting feature of Dearborn Observatory is the lens that is situated in the telescope tube. One of the great pieces of optical equipment of its time, and still remains a very impressive piece of glass. The lens was commissioned and ground for the University of Mississippi. Unfortunately for Mississippi, the Civil War intervened and the lens traveled from its grinder in Cambridge, Massachusetts to Chicago, where it became part of the Dearborn Observatory and ultimately relocated here to Evanston.
Dearborn was also home to the university's first mainframe computer, an IBM 650 installed in 1957. The observatory houses the Department of Physics and Astronomy and continues to host public stargazing sessions every Friday night.
This is Lund Hall, which is now the home of the math department, but it has had a variety of roles since it was opened in 1894. It also has notes of what would become modern architecture, and if you'll have a visit to this at some point and see the entry, you'll see many of the arts and crafts and even prairie-style touches that would characterize architecture from this point forward.
Keeping up with increasing enrollment at the end of the 19th century, the university continued to grow with the completion of Annie Mae Swift Hall in 1895.
Swift Hall was the home to the School of Oratory, later the School of Speech, and now the School of Communication. Funds for the construction of Annie Mae Swift came from the Swift family of Chicago, a very important Chicago family involved in meat packing.
Actors such as Anne Margaret and Charlton Heston got their start on stage at Annie Mae Swift, performing in campus productions while they were students.
Fisk Hall at the southern tip of Northwestern's Evanston campus dates to the last years of the 19th century. It was designed by the firm of Daniel Burnham, the celebrated Chicago architect, and it was built originally as a secondary school operated by the university. It was done in a Romanesque revival style, named for Herbert Franklin Fisk, who was the longtime principal of the secondary school. It's now home to the university's celebrated Medill School of Journalism. The extreme north end of campus is devoted to housing and recreational uses. This area is a quadrangle of housing units incorporating university buildings and private fraternities. This marks Northwestern's first foray into providing housing for students on a large scale. Prior to about 1914, the opportunities to secure university housing were very limited for students. They would board with families in town or join private fraternities. In the early 20th century, the university developed this area in cooperation with fraternities to provide a more structured environment for students.
As the university continued to expand in the early 20th century, a new home was needed for Northwestern's burgeoning social science departments.
Harris Hall was constructed in 1915. It's done in a very restrained classical style. The architect was Charles A. Coolidge of Boston, and Harris Hall was designed and built as the home at Northwestern for political science, history, economics, and sociology.
And while Coolidge designed Harris Hall to last, the changing needs of higher education in the 21st century recently called for a complete renovation of this early 20th century building. The two-year project completely transformed the interior, upgrading technology, classroom space, and accessibility, and improving sustainability. Up next, we'll explore the work of Northwestern's first official campus architect and learn about the birth of a new campus for the university. As the 20th century dawned, Northwestern's campus still lacked an overall architectural vision. To provide some much-needed order, James Gamble Rogers was appointed as the university's first architect in 1921. He was tasked with developing an architectural style for new buildings in Evanston, as well as those for the new professional school campus to be built on recently acquired land in downtown Chicago.
James Gamble Rogers left a very significant imprint on Northwestern's campus. He did so many buildings here beginning in the 1920s, but he did them in a fairly uniform style. Now, it's very easy to pick out a James Gamble Rogers building here at Northwestern, but it's also significant to note that architects who have worked for the university have taken their cues from Rogers, from the limestone, the chromatic keys that he established, from the muted Gothic detailing that appears on buildings built in decades subsequent to Rogers' own work.
One of Rogers' most architecturally satisfying buildings on the Evanston campus is Deering Library, completed in 1933. Now home to a variety of special library collections, Deering's ornate Gothic style makes it a favorite study spot for students.
For those of you who have time to visit the campus, come into Deering. It's a repository not only of books and knowledge, but of architectural detail that is surprising in its variety. There are stone carvings from Aesop's fables. There are stained glass windows relating to mythology. It's really an incredible place.
Rogers' next project is recognizable to sports fans throughout the Big Ten and around the country. Opened in 1926, Dyke Stadium was considered one of the finest football facilities in the country. In their first season there, the Northwestern Wildcats shared the Big Ten championship with Michigan. Now known as Ryan Field, the stadium has served as the stage for many cardiac cat comebacks over the years.
We witness Rogers' importance not only here being the centerpiece of what really is Northwestern's sacred space, but also at Ryan Field, which was designed in a way that demonstrates that he was a great classicist, but he was also a great modernist at the same time. Ryan Field was designed after some version of Roman baths with the great arches which hold the thing up. But it was also very scientifically designed in terms of the curve of the grandstand and also the bowl-like character of the rake of the stands, making the sight lines optimal for every spectator.
Working hand in hand with James Gamble Rogers was the university's president, Walter Dill Scott. Walter Dill Scott was a towering figure in Northwestern's history. He was essentially the first modern president. He came here at a time when the university started acquiring significant amounts of funding. He presided over the first major fundraising campaigns. He was very successful in raising funds, and he allowed the university to expand its physical presence here on the Evanston campus, but also to build a campus in Chicago as well for the professional schools.
After purchasing 9 acres in the Streeterville neighborhood of Chicago, Scott turned to Rogers for an architectural style that would rival the city's skyscrapers.
Well, the focus of the campus, of course, is the Medical Dental Center. So it's a high-rise sort of place, and it's very compact as compared to the Evanston campus. The early fathers of the university had offices on the west side of the Loop, and they chose the spot in Evanston, but they wanted to keep the professional schools, as it were, in an urban area, so they'd have patients to draw from. Law firms were downtown, and the businesses were downtown for the Commerce School. So it made sense to have those programs down here.
The Montgomery Ward building was constructed to house the medical school and the dental school, making it the world's first high-rise medical center.
In the area here, there was nothing else around it, so it really stood out, and was quite a proud fact for the city of Chicago to have this 20-story building in 1926.
One of the challenges facing Northwestern with regard to its Chicago campus is the relatively small size of its property. Nonetheless, the university has found very creative ways to enhance its space and enhance its activities on a restricted urban piece of property. The Lurie building, which opened in 2005, allowed the university to greatly expand its facilities and laboratories associated with medical research.
There is something that connects the two campuses together. Early buildings on the Chicago campus were designed by James Gamble Rogers in the early 20s, and they're very much in keeping with the same style as the work he did in Evanston, the collegiate Gothic style. So there is something very Northwestern about our campus in Chicago that it's a nice tie between the two campuses. Although they're 13 miles apart, they're both on the lakefront, and they both have a similar sense of materiality as well as a link in architectural sort of history.
Back in Evanston, plans were underway for a sprawling new building to house Northwestern's growing scientific endeavors.
Northwestern's curricular programs in engineering were modest in the early decades of the 20th century, but great plans were afoot in the 1930s, and by 1942 the Technological Institute was dedicated. The Technological Institute is a massive, sprawling building, and any student will tell you that it can be sometimes a great challenge to find your way from one side to the other.
The initial floor plan for Tech was 500,000 square feet, and subsequent additions have made it even larger. Up next, we discover how the university, desperate for space, turned water into land. By the mid-20th century, Northwestern University found itself desperate for space. Surrounded by the city of Evanston on one side and Lake Michigan on the other, the school had to think outside of the box.
The university could not expand into Evanston, and so therefore the amount of acreage available for an expanding program at an ambitious university with robust plans left no options other than the amazing option of expanding into Lake Michigan. I was very fortunate to come in 1968, which was the period at which the university was taking a broader look, and also because of the expansion into Lake Michigan, a tremendous opportunity, or if you will, raw undeveloped land was available.
Using sand imported on barges from Indiana, the Lakeville project took 2.5 years to complete and created 84 acres of new real estate. For the building boom that followed, organizing the campus became a priority. The first plan for the 70s sought to formalize guidelines for campus development.
The plan for the 70s did create 3 zones on campus. Science buildings being placed on the north end of campus, social sciences being in the middle, and humanities on the south end. And we have continued with that.
Northwestern turned to architect Walter Netsch to design the major buildings of the new Lakeville campus.
Walter Netsch was one of the leaders and visionaries in the architectural world for, 10, 15, 20 years. And I think the university responded very positively to the experiments, or really the mathematical aspects of his design. I think he was foremost an intellectual who then assigned rules and concepts from which he then developed his designs.
A lot of Walter Netsch's buildings in the 70s continued that idea that buildings were placed as objects to be seen from all sides in space in a park setting.
I think one of the things that the Northwestern traditionally has done very well is to define the use up front, way before architects became involved with the design of a building. And I think in general, even buildings that are perhaps architecturally less stunning, you almost uniformly meet the user requirements very well.
Walter Netsch had a remarkable influence on Northwestern's look, and he was responsible for designing the Lakeville campus and for siting the buildings on the Lakeville campus, particularly down here at the south end in the Arts Circle.
The addition of Pickstager Concert Hall in 1975 and the award-winning Block Museum expansion in 2000 amplified the focus on visual and performing arts on the southern end of campus. Up next, we head to North Campus to explore some of Northwestern's newest buildings. Cutting-edge scientific facilities designed to encourage a new level of interdisciplinary research. Northwestern entered the 21st century with a vision for and a commitment to groundbreaking scientific research. What was needed now were state-of-the-art facilities in which to bring those discoveries to life. The solution? A North Campus Science Quadrangle.
I think within our new collection of buildings, I think the Ford building has probably been our most successful building on campus. I think that the design really supports the ability for students to interact together. It's full of daylight, it's a very warm building, and very accessible to the student population.
This is what we now know as the Science Quadrangle, which is the newest section of the campus. What's very interesting about this area is that it's a quadrangle of the sort that Northwestern really doesn't have anyplace else.
All of our science buildings actually are connected via bridges, pedestrian bridges, which is a requirement of the scientists. And so by keeping those in a strict zone, it enables us to do that. The recently completed Silverman Hall was an interesting project and a great opportunity for us to complete what we consider sort of the North Campus Science Quad. From Silverman Hall, all of those buildings are complete in one necklace, which is a really interesting concept, and certainly a lot of the scientists talk about the strength of Northwestern as being that collaboration and having those scientists all together in the same building and being able to interconnect amongst labs and research groups.
The other very interesting aspect of this area, this cluster of buildings, is that it recognizes that Northwestern has become an urban campus. We're in what is recognized as a medium-sized city. It's no longer a rural setting as it was when the campus was first designed. In many ways, this represents the future of the university.
It's a long-term institution. So the buildings, I don't think they can be tricky, they can't be flip, they can't be too interesting, they have to have a certain dignity to them, a certain gravitas.
Ultimately, architects and buildings really must respond to a higher vision that the university itself develops.
This is a great university, and it's a great campus, and so you want to bring your best moment to it.
Throughout Northwestern's 160-year history, the university's architecture has reflected the evolving needs of the institution and the changing architectural styles of the day. The buildings are a testament to the school's ever-expanding educational mission and reflective of its growing strengths.
I think what's important here is a building that is not for the first 2 or 3 years, not for the first 10 years. Something that's for the years 60 to 70 to 80 years from now, that you look at a building and it still works.